Kristy. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. We have the pleasure to have you here with us virtually, Télécom Sans Frontières. We're joined by Kristy Crabtree, Technology for Program Strategy Lead, and you previously worked as a senior advisor on digital innovation within the Violence and Response Unit at International Rescue Committee. You also worked with several UN agencies. You're an author. You host a podcast. I hope I'm not forgetting any
No, you've captured
additional.
it well.
Okay, so anything to add about your current position at Rescue?
No, I think you've covered it. I've worked across our protection programs most in depth, but I'm also working across different sectors of work. So, um, from economic recovery, education, health, governance, supporting those units as well with technology in their programs.
Okay, cool. That's really amazing. And we are contacting you because we found an amazing study that you contributed with on the importance of digital literacy and focusing on women and girls when it comes to the gender digital gap. And especially in humanitarian settings, the study focused on Lebanon and displaced communities. So, basing on this study, why is it important to focus on girls and women's ICT needs when in humanitarian settings or when doing digital training?
Yeah, it's a really essential question that I think gets overlooked most of the time. So, in humanitarian settings, women and girls face greater barriers to accessing and using technology as compared to men and boys. We know this from the research we conducted in Lebanon in 2017, in research we did in Uganda in 2019 that's published in an editorial book, and then proxy surveying that we did in a number of countries in 2020. What gets confirmed again and again is that there are gendered barriers to access and usage. These barriers are attributed roughly to four categories that we've identified in our research. The first one is around public space restrictions. So, women and girls are often restricted from public spaces that could be school, work, or other gathering places in a community. And this weakens their natural exposure to mobile technology and the internet. The second one is harmful attitudes. So, negative attitudes toward women and girls' use of phones and the internet really negatively affects their ability to build digital literacy organically and without any intervention. Third, lack of access to devices. The number one barrier reported by women and girls in Lebanon and Uganda was the prohibitive cost of devices and internet access or credit. Many shared that there is a smartphone in their household, but it's usually held by a male family member. And then the last factor is lack of technical confidence, which really contributes to a lack of desire. So these harmful social norms and restrictions limit women and girls' access to ICTs, which weakens their exposure and their confidence, and then even weakens the desire for access. So when we're thinking about humanitarian settings and the broad scope of work that's being done, we need to focus on women and girls for any kind of digital training because we want to build toward an equitable world. And if we create a mobile app or a virtual information service or really any other access point that's digital, some might promote that as having greater reach. There's better flexibility, there's increased access, but we're really making an assumption about who has access. We know women and girls in low and middle income countries have reduced access. And in humanitarian settings, we see the same, if not worse, trends. So keeping women and girls at the center of planning and really being proactive to give them opportunities for digital upskilling is really essential. Otherwise, we're going to see this gender digital divide expand. And actually, it has gotten a little bit worse in 2022 after getting a little bit better in the years leading up to that. So really, we want to be aiming for something more in these spaces.
Hey, thank you. Amazing. And I'm glad that you mentioned something because it relates to my next question. You talked about how one of the main challenges is not having access to a smartphone, for instance. And I read in your research that most of the women that you interviewed or that were included in the study, they either borrow or share a mobile phone with family members, intimate partners, and this can sometimes be challenging because most of the time their use is being monitored, which is dangerous and challenging, especially if these women are using the ICT services to seek help when they're in a vulnerable situation and when they are being victim of gender-based violence. So, how can we create online and offline safe spaces for these women when they are when they don't have their proper phone, when they're being monitored?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different answers to this. There's a lot of work that we can do. Um, I'll speak maybe first to the offline spaces. In terms of offline safe spaces, in my mind, it's easiest to start where there's already something that's developed there. So in humanitarian settings, there are often these spaces that are called Women and Girls Safe Spaces, or WGSS, or some variation of that name. And these are physical spaces where women and adolescent girls are free from harm and harassment. There are no men allowed in that setting. It's usually like a small 1 or 2 room um, place. And the focus of these spaces is for women and girls to gain knowledge and skills, access GBV response services or other available services, and really to foster opportunities for mutual support and collective action in their community. And these have been used for decades by GBV actors in humanitarian programming as an entry point for women and adolescent girls to report protection concerns like gender-based violence, to voice their needs, to build up their own in-person social networks. And the organizations that run these spaces can be really great partners for any work that we're trying to do in helping women stay safe online. Um, in terms of how to stay safe online, how to make it safer for women and girls, there are several practical actions that we can take. The first one that I would encourage is conducting an ICT assessment. And the point of that is really to determine levels of access and barriers. That's a first. Understand in your setting what the starting point is, because it's going to vary a lot if we're comparing West Africa to Latin America, for example. What are the unique risks experienced by women and girls in that setting? And ask women and girls what they need to stay safe online. That seems obvious, but it's often skipped. One way to help, and this is kind of a thread throughout many things I'm going to talk about today, is with digital literacy training. And that could take place in a safe space, a safe setting, like the Women and Girls Safe Space I just mentioned. And you could walk through, again, depending on your setting and what the needs are, things from basic phone operation, what are digital accounts, what are apps, how to find information online, how to think critically about that information, and have an explicit focus on how to stay safe. We at International Rescue Committee have a Creative Commons licensed curriculum that's publicly available and designed to be gender sensitive and safety prioritizing, and built into these women and girls safe spaces. That's an option, but it's not the only one. That could be something that's useful in your setting, or it could be a setting where what women need is a bit more advanced in terms of safety online, in which you could look at things like social media self-defense. This is something that the Australia E-Safety Commission has been working on. It really depends on the need and the starting point in your setting. There's a lot of other actions we could take based off that. You could look at legislative changes to criminalize technology facilitated gender-based violence. A great resource on that comes from UNFPA. It's called Making All Spaces Safe, and they're going to be putting out more resources along that line. In terms of online safe spaces, first, of course, we want to listen to what women and girls want. Ask them, what do they want? What do they need? Let's not just come with a solution up front. And if this can be complemented by what comes out of your ICT assessment, great. Women and girls in any particular setting know what is safe for them and what isn't, so start with them. One thing that I have seen work is a site called LAHA, LAAHA.org. This is an example of an online safe space that's targeted toward adolescent girls, and it was developed by UNICEF. So I think those are some starting points of how we could start to think about offline and online safety for women and girls.
Absolutely. I think assessments are really interesting. And as you said, uh, ask girls because they know what they want. Sometimes women and girls are just not included, or their opinion are not being taken into consideration. Another example that I really thought was interesting, you mentioned in your study, is the My Plan app, because it helps women stay safe from potentially abusive partner or people that are monitoring their use. And I absolutely agree that digital literacy is very important and the first step. We are currently conducting a project in Syria with a local organization, Zoomin, and we are providing training to women from Syria in digital literacy, internet safety, digital security, and prevention from blackmail and electronic threats. Another question is, how can NGOs, humanitarian actors, service providers help women stay safe in sensitive settings? Because maybe sometimes the intention is to help, but that's not really the result because they're not really listening to the needs.
Yeah.
So how can they do a better job?
First, it depends on who's trying to push this effort. If it's not coming from gender-based violence practitioners or protection practitioners, which it's often not, then it's helpful up front to frame the thinking on the topic. So just to give people some context about what women and girls are facing, many of us might be also making assumptions based off our own lived experiences of what it's like, but that doesn't mean that everybody has that base of knowledge. So sharing with them the global trends around gender-based violence, how widespread it is, especially in conflict settings where natural protection supports are weakened and where violence often intensifies. Women are facing increased physical, sexual, psychological, economic violence, including intimate partner violence. And this is important to flag because stigma and fear may prevent people from seeking any kind of help. So that's really important for people to know as a base, because considering the harmful social norms around technology, many thinking that ICTs are unacceptable for women, we have to consider this when we're planning digital interventions, ask about risks and prioritize safety before introducing technology that could potentially increase harm. So of course there's the talking to women and girls, but what does that mean? First, we have to figure out when and where it's safe to do that. And that's where partnering with existing providers of gender-based violence or women's empowerment programs can be a great thing. So you're not just going around a community and knocking on doors, but you can reach women where they already feel safe. One thing that could be a helpful activity in that is to do a kind of digital safety mapping. So safety mapping has been done by gender-based violence practitioners for decades. So if we think about a refugee camp, for example, they might go around with women and ask, what is safe or unsafe about these latrines, or the way you go to the market, or the way you access food, or the way you access these services, and what's not working and why. The same thing could be done for digital products. So you could think about it as a user journey, if that's easier for the kind of tech-minded folks to think about. What are all the touch points women and girls might have with technology in that particular setting? And where is it safe or unsafe? Or where does it fall on that spectrum of safe or unsafe? How is that viewed? What would women and girls like? That would be a really useful exercise as a starting point. So you're taking into consideration the context that women are stepping into, where they come to the table, and what they want, and what might genuinely help them, rather than the common thing of, a lot of technology solutions are a hammer trying to find a nail. Let's start with not with the solution, but with women and girls want and what feels safe to them, and we can always expand and extend out from there.
Absolutely. I have a question just to understand even better how the context and different experiences can shape the needs. What was the striking difference between the assessment done in Uganda and the assessment done in Lebanon, just to understand even more the cultural differences and context and how it can really make a difference?
What stood out to me the most was how few differences there were between the two. That's one of the reasons we started with Lebanon, because there was an interest in using more technology in that setting. And so we were like, let's think about this first. What's it like? And we did surveying with women, girls, men, and boys separately. And so we could disaggregate the analysis according to those characteristics. We did the same thing in Uganda, and I expected there to be a lot of differences between the two settings because the uptake of technology is different between the two spaces. And from my perception as an outsider, I thought that there were different levels of acceptability as well. We saw very similar things in the two settings. What came up most often from men and sometimes women as well was that there is a strong perception that when women are in virtual spaces, they're going to be engaging or they're going to have romantic engagements, I'll say. And that was drawing out a lot of fear from men and some assumptions from some women, though it was a much smaller degree. But that was the number one thing that men were reporting fear about. And that's what was why they were enforcing these kind of barriers in their homes or in their communities about what was acceptable for women and girls to do. That really surprised me about those two settings, that came up as the most common concern across the board. There were other variances that were much smaller in terms of how people would rank maybe the third or fourth levels of concern, but those were much smaller and really not very statistically significant. What came across in both settings was how often phones are shared or borrowed, which, if there's a takeaway from this, in going forward, it's not only to assess, but to have an assumption about what levels of safety are needed because phones are shared or borrowed. If we think about that for any of us that are in households where everybody has their own device, even if there's nothing nefarious going on with your phone, there's just a sense of privacy that's different if it's shared or borrowed. So that impacts a lot of the services offered, a lot of what we'd consider safe communication methods, and would impact a lot about how developers make a digital product or how they expect people to access it. And then related to that, even if phones aren't shared, there is a trend in both of those settings of phone monitoring. So maybe I, as the mom in the household, have my own phone, but it's being monitored by my husband. So that makes engagements difficult that way as well. So ways that we could, in that example, mask sensitive content. Maybe instead of having a site that says, "Hey, report GBV incidents here," and the name of the site is reportgbv.com, we would think about ways to mask that information by putting it in, "Hey, this is a site about humanitarian services," and you've got like health, economic information, all other types of services, and one part of one of those services happens to be GBV. So then the URL and what they're accessing is not something that's going to flag and then potentially create more harm in the household.
Thank you. That's actually very interesting that despite the geographical, cultural differences between Uganda and Lebanon, but the problems of women are the same. I also expected to have more differences. Yeah. Another question is why is it important and how can digital literacy and women's online safety help bridge the gender gap in humanitarian settings and in general?
At IRC, we have a whole theory of change around digital inclusion. It goes beyond women and girls because also elderly and rural populations are experience similar gaps. Um, so there are a lot of different factors to consider in this, some which are in our control, and some which aren't. So some things like in a setting where the only way to get a phone or the only way to up your credit on your phone or your data is to go to the market, which might be a restricted area for some women, or to talk to a man at the market to get that. So there are some things there that we are capable of changing, but it requires some different work and some different partnerships there. One of the things that digital literacy allows us to do is to control one aspect of that very broad theory of change. So if we go back to the barriers I mentioned at the very beginning, public space restrictions, harmful attitudes, lack of access to devices, lack of technical competence. If we look at a digital literacy program, it has the possibility, if it's done right, to address all four of these issues. So, for example, the digital literacy curriculum we have at IRC, we recently rolled this out in Yemen, which is a context that has a lot of barriers traditionally for women to do digital upskilling. We did the digital literacy training in our women and girls safe space. So that gets around the public space restrictions, right? It's already in a place where women and girls can go. And then the harmful attitudes piece, we made sure that any women that were participating in this felt like in their household, for them personally, that this would be a safe activity for them to do, and gave them information about how they could talk about it in their household so that there aren't assumptions made that women are just getting access to these and then doing whatever people are afraid of them doing. In that, we gave library access to devices. So that gets around the lack of access to devices. It doesn't get around it forever, and that's something that has to still be addressed. And then the digital literacy content itself gets around this issue of lack of technical competence. So there are ways that we can address those barriers as, in my case, humanitarian practitioner. There are ways that other partners and stakeholders in a setting could help to address these things as well, right? One interesting proposal is for governments to add more e-government governance offerings. For example, if you wanted to change a residency permit or access some other government service, if more of these were online, it would create a kind of pull factor or an encouraging way for women and girls to have a need to be online to perform some of these activities. So if we look at the whole web of things that are attached to the gender digital divide, there are a lot of different threads that we can pull to create progress in these areas. Digital literacy is one of those pieces. There are many others, but there are ways that we can really address those barriers in that.
Thank you so much. And finally, moving to the last question, I don't want to take more of your time. Any final words for any humanitarian actor, someone in any organization in the ICT sector, how they can perform a better job, or women that are in vulnerable situations, or anyone who's listening in terms of better use of internet and safer internet access?
Yeah, the takeaways that I would love for anyone who's thinking about this is to don't make assumptions about anything. Or if you're making an assumption, fault on the side of what is safe for women and girls based off the type of information we shared in this interview. So don't make assumptions about equity and access. What we know is that that is not true in a majority of low and middle income countries and in humanitarian settings. And then very simply, learn more information about your environment and talk to women and girls when and where it's safe for them. That is so often missed. It's so obvious. So I just want to highlight, bold, underline that point. But I think one of the selling points of this, because digital literacy isn't always something that wows donors. It's not a new concept. It doesn't involve AI. So one way that we can maybe talk about this in a way that's appealing to a broader audience is to talk about digital upskilling or digital literacy or thinking about women and girls um, as a leverage point. So we know that there are only going to be more and more tools and services that use some kind of digital access point going into the future. It's not going to go backwards. It's only going to be more and more and more. If we want to have equity, we have to make sure that we're doing something to get women and girls to the same starting line as men and boys. But really, we can think about this as an investment because digital literacy, what we've seen just from the perspective of IRC, is that this is a leverage point to everything else. So when women and girls get connected online, they can access information and make better decisions for them and their entire household. They can start from that point and access things like better livelihood opportunities. We saw this just in our rollout in Yemen. At the end of the curriculum, the number one request from the women and girls was that they wanted to get trained on mobile phone repair. And this was really interesting to us. What they said is that this both would aid in their safety and not having to go to the market and hand over to their phone to somebody who might potentially use what's on their phone as blackmail. But it also would give them a livelihood opportunity that they hadn't had before. So not only could they fix their own phone, but they could do this for other women and girls in the setting. And that is, I think, a really interesting and more compelling story for us to tell than just digital literacy as an end in itself. We're battling against some really innovative ideas and anything that has AI attached to it. So where we can talk about this as this is a jumping off point to so many other greater things for women and girls, I think that's a really helpful framing for us to take forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all your amazing insights. I have definitely learned a lot, and I hope whoever is going to watch this interview will also learn from your insightful comments and learn how to deliver a better job as a humanitarian actor or help people who are in need.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kristy, for your time. And well, I hope we can get to talk to you another time.
Of course. Thank you.